Jesus was a healer. Jesus is a healer. And one of the things that we have learned, particularly in our Catholic faith, is that healing gift is something he shares very much with his Blessed Mother, the one whom we know under the title of our Mother of Perpetual Help. The healing that Jesus brings is so striking in the Gospels. It is the healing of the sick. It is helping the blind to see, the deaf to hear, the lame to walk, and occasionally it is even raising somebody from the dead. We see these things as miracles. I want you to see them as healing, because you see, as Jesus was a healer, I think he wants us to be healers as well. But this is where we need to understand something about miracles. And I think it was something that Jesus himself learned as he performed these miracles and continued his journey. It's that people often want you for themselves, for the miracle that they can get, but they haven't really listened to or heard the message of Jesus. And this is where I want to make this distinction between miracles and healing. And to do that, I want to tell two stories. The first story occurred in my life when I was a seminarian in Europe, in Germany. And at one point we had some vacation time, and I went with one of our Swiss Redemptor students to his home in Switzerland. And we were having a very good time, visiting various places and enjoying the food and the culture. But Joseph's mother asked us one afternoon to be home at her place because she wanted us to learn something. So we did. We stayed there. And just after lunch, there was a lady, Mary, who was 63 years old, who came to visit Joseph's mother. And we had a little chit-chat and whatnot, and it looked like we were getting restless and we were ready to go, and Joseph's mother said, "Please, Mary, tell them your story." Now, she told this story in a very simple language, in a very simple way, and I won't do it justice, but here's what she told us. When she was a teenager, she contracted tuberculosis. This would have been back in the 1920s. And there was no cure for tuberculosis at that time. And so gradually she got sicker and sicker and more bedridden. And she had reached the point where now, even being bedridden, her body was breaking out in sores. Sores that festered and that would not heal. She was getting very close to death. But around that time, the villagers decided that they wanted to make a pilgrimage to Lourdes. She heard about this, and she asked if they would take her along. And several of the young men in the village volunteered to take her on a stretcher. The pilgrims were there for 3 days. In each of those 3 days, as was the custom, they took this woman and they dipped her in the waters at Lourdes. And there was nothing spectacular happened. They all joined together in prayer, the devotions around the presence of Mary at the shrine. And then the third day came, and it was time to go home. And they put her on her stretcher, and they carried her to the train. And when they got to the train, she begged them to go back one more time to be dipped in the water. And the others said, "But we've done that for 3 days. There's no point." But she begged them, "Please, one more time." So they took her down to the waters, they dipped her in, and instantly she was completely cured. She walked up out of the waters, and as so often happens at Lourdes, the people that were in charge there, recognizing that there was something extraordinary that had happened, wrapped her in a blanket and took her out through a side door. And one of the things that they do at that time was check to see if she really is now healthy. So there were 3 doctors that tested her out. And they all proclaimed that she was perfectly healthy. There was no sign of TB. Now, when she told this story, and she told it in this very simple German language, I was completely in awe, not so much of the miracle, but of this woman who had experienced it. Because she had been totally cured, her life was filled with gratitude. She spent much of her life doing good for others. It was a very simple life. She worked in a bakery for 40 years. But she was a joy in her entire village. And what I remember very clearly afterwards, when we talked with Joseph's mother the next day, we thanked her for bringing Maria over to us. Joseph's mother said, "I know God is calling both of you to be priests, and I want you to know what God can do." So that's the first story. The second story comes from the biography that I was reading earlier this year of one of the great saints that most of us know nothing about, St. Francis of Paola. He was a hermit, he was a recluse, he was an ascetic, he was very severe on himself. He basically lived on what we today would call a vegan diet. And when others came, because they were attracted by him, he founded monasteries. They were called the minimalists or the minims because they lived such a simple, austere, strict life. Well, when you read his story, it's full of miracles. Eventually, the King of France, who had a very severe illness, heard about St. Francis. And he wrote to him asking if he would come and cure him. And when eventually he saw the king was absolutely thrilled and was already planning his life after he would be cured. But Francis spent months with him, getting him to understand one very simple thing. It was not God's will that he be cured. In discussions with one of his other priests, Francis mentioned very simply, if I give him this cure, which God would give him, he will be damned. But if he lives with this illness until he dies, he will go to heaven. And eventually the king understood that this was the choice, and he lived under Francis's guidance until he died a holy death. Now, why do I tell those two stories? First of all, I tell them because there are still miracles taking place in this world. But you know what the greatest miracle is in our world? The greatest miracle is discerning and following the will of God wherever it leads us. And this is where I want you to understand today that so very often when you and I approach God, we approach God in rather selfish ways. We've got our needs and our wants, and it's not bad to ask God to help us with those things. But unless we learn to pray as Jesus prayed in the Garden of Gethsemane, Father, I beg you, take this cup away from me. I don't think I can handle it. But not my will, yours be done. Until we get to that point of sincerity in our prayer, then I fear that very often what we are trying to do is manipulate God instead of opening our hearts to God and letting God lead and guide us.